This is going to be our first lesson of phase 2 of our learning, and we're going to be doing some new content. So we are going to pick up where we left off. So if you remember, before we went on the quarantine, we read this book about Gregor Mendel, the friar who grew peas. And remember that he was a monk and he used peas to try and figure out how inheritance works. So one of the things, and you read about this in the work that you did on Friday, he learned that certain traits will sometimes seem to skip a generation. People would predict that you would just get the average of 2 traits. So, for example, if you bred a red flower and a blue flower together, you would predict you'd get a purple flower. But instead, he found that you got one trait or the other, and sometimes it would skip a generation. So we're going to learn about why that happened. So to start out, let's remember where these traits come from. We learned that traits come from DNA. And on DNA, you have genes. So that's where we're going to start today. We're going to start talking about how you can have different kinds of genes. So let's start with some vocabulary. Our focus today is going to be on vocabulary. Then we're going to learn how to draw something called a Punnett square, and we'll practice those more next week. But this week, your focus is on learning the vocabulary. So first vocab word that we need to know is alleles. So we talked about you having different types of genes. An allele is a type of a gene. So the alleles are different forms of a gene. We'll use the example of eye color. So you can have multiple different alleles for eye color. You might have an allele for brown eyes. You might have an allele for blue eyes. Now, overall, you can have 2 different kinds of alleles. And we started using this term a little bit with Mendel. So the first kind of allele you can have a dominant allele. If an allele is dominant, that means that this is a trait that always shows up. And this is just specifically talking about simple inheritance. We're not talking here, there's a lot of complexity to this. We're starting out simple with what's called Mendelian inheritance. So when you have a dominant allele, this is the allele that's like the more powerful allele. This is the allele you're going to see when you combine things. You'll only see this allele. You can also have a recessive allele. If an allele is recessive, it is the trait that can be hidden by a dominant allele. And we can talk about alleles being dominant and recessive, and we can talk about traits being dominant and recessive. Now, when we are taking notes about these, we can use letters to abbreviate these. So the way we figure out a letter, what letter we should use to represent it, is we use the letter, the first letter, of whatever our dominant trait is. So in this case, we're talking about blue eyes and brown eyes. Brown eyes are dominant. And so we're going to represent it with a capital B. If your DNA, if your gene has a dominant allele for the trait brown eyes, we would note that with a B. Blue eyes are recessive. We're going to use a lowercase b to represent that. So if you have a gene in your DNA for blue eyes, we would show that by using a B to represent it. Now, something that we learned also is that you get genes from both of your parents. And so what that means is that you're going to have 2 copies of every allele. So for every trait, you're going to get 2 genes, one from your mother, one from your father, one from your egg, and one from your sperm cell. So that's where these letters come in handy. Now, we can note what kind of DNA you have by putting the letters together. So let's say you're somebody who has brown eyes, and your mom had brown eyes, and your dad had brown eyes, and they both contributed a brown-eyed gene, a brown-eyed allele. In that case, your but we call this a genotype, would be capital B, capital B. Maybe you could get one brown-eyed gene, and maybe your mom has blue eyes, and she gives you a blue-eyed gene. Or you could also have two alleles, two genes for blue eyes. And notice that we have the difference. We're showing the difference by capital letters. This is going to be really important to pay attention to in your worksheets because sometimes the autocorrect will change the capital letters and make, especially with this one, they'll make that a capital B. So it's important to pay attention to that. Now there are names that we can use. There's some more vocabulary we can use to talk about these things. And so we would call this, we'd call both this person and this person, we're going to use the term homozygous. And we're going to say this person is homozygous dominant. And this person is homozygous recessive. And this is a term, this word, homozygous. That homo means same, meaning your two alleles are the same allele. So if you have two copies of the same allele, whether it's the dominant or the recessive, you are considered to be homozygous. Now this guy in the middle, he has one copy of brown eyes and one copy of blue eyes. He is heterozygous. And we don't have to say dominant because he has one of each. So we just say he's heterozygous. And hetero, where homo means same, hetero means other or different. So he has two different alleles. So homozygous versus heterozygous. So you're going to be practicing these. You're going to practice all these terms a lot this week. You're going to practice what is dominant versus recessive. You're going to practice homozygous versus heterozygous. So, next thing we want to talk about is, all right, so we've got these genes. Well, if you have these alleles, what trait are you actually going to have? So if you have two parents who both have brown eyes, and they've both given you the brown-eyed allele, you are going to have, you're going to exhibit the trait of having brown eyes. If you get two copies of the blue-eyed gene, because even though this is recessive, two copies of the blue-eyed gene, you're going to have blue eyes. Now, with this trait, with our heterozygous trait, this is where we have to think about it, and this is where being dominant comes into play. So, because we have one copy of the dominant allele, we think of this allele as being more powerful than our recessive allele. So this brown-eyed allele is going to overpower the blue-eyed allele. So instead of having like brownish-bluish eyes, this person would have brown eyes. This is not true of all traits, but for the traits we're going to look at now, until I tell you differently, we're going to always assume that this is called completely dominant, meaning it will completely overpower. You won't see blue eyes. So this is a reason why you might see blue eyes skipping a generation or disappearing. Or you could have a parent with brown eyes who has a blue-eyed kid. So I'm going to show you sort of the math of why that happens. So this is the start of where we're talking about alleles. Now we have a couple more vocab words I want to show you. I already used the term once, but these alleles, these are your genes. This is what's in your DNA sequence. We call this is your genotype. Literally, your type of genes. So we call this genotype. This is your phenotype. So genotype is your genes. It's your genetic makeup. It's your alleles. I should do that in blue. So this is your alleles. This is what genes you have. Your phenotype is what traits you have. You could think of it as appearance. You could also think of this having to do with your proteins. Remember we said that DNA makes proteins. Proteins give you traits. So your phenotype is what trait you're having. So we would say genotype, and you would give me the letters. You would tell me the letters of which gene the person has. And if I asked for the phenotype, you'd say that person has brown eyes. You would not tell me he is homozygous dominant. You wouldn't say he has capital B, capital B. Phenotype would be brown eyes. Okay. So, next thing that we want to do, so we want to talk about how this happens with parents. This is going to be the focus for this week, but I want to introduce you to a Punnett square to help you understand how this can happen. So, I'm going to put this aside. I'm going to start a fresh piece of paper. Well, we are going to draw something new called a Punnett square, and this is capitalized. Punnett is capitalized because it is named after a scientist. 2 N's, 2 T's. Now, a Punnett square is used to predict what babies from a certain cross of parents, or what offspring from a certain cross of parents will have as their genotype and their traits and their phenotype. So, let's say we have 2 parents. We're going to say, we'll do 2 examples to show the difference here. So, we're going to say our first cross is going to be a brown-eyed parent who is homozygous dominant. They have brown eyes. So their genotype is homozygous dominant. Their phenotype is going to be brown eyes. Is going to mate with a blue-eyed parent. So this person is homozygous recessive. And we didn't want to know, what could their baby's eyes be? Could they have a blue-eyed baby? So here's how we draw our Punnett square. We're going to draw, it is literally a square. And we're going to do this. Now, next, we are going to put one parent's alleles across the top. So we'll say that this is mom, and we'll say this is dad. So mom's genotype is B, B. Dad's genotype is lowercase b, lowercase b. Now the reason we're doing this is because we know that for each baby they are going to have, that baby's going to get one allele from each parent. So for mom, it could get a B or a capital B or a capital B. For dad, it could get a lowercase b or a lowercase b, right? But it's only going to get one allele from each parent, and the allele that it gets is random. So, for example, I can't predict what color my baby's eyes are going to be because the genes that my husband and I pass down to the baby are randomly selected during cell division when we make the egg and the sperm. So, what we're going to do is now we want to know, what is the genotype of the potential babies going to be? So, we're going to treat this kind of like a multiplication table. We're going to look and see, all right, so this potential baby could have one dominant allele and one recessive allele. So I'm doing that by combining these, just like you do with a multiplication table. And in this box, we'll have the B, and we always put the capital first. It's just one of the sort of the rules, just to make it easier. And here again, we have capital B, lowercase b, and capital B, lowercase b for the last. So this is going to show us that all 4 babies are now, what's this term? Capital B, lowercase b, not homozygous like their parents. These babies, all 4 potential babies that these parents could create, are going to be heterozygous. And so what trait are they going to have? All of these babies are going to have brown eyes. So there's no way that a homozygous dominant parent could mate with a homozygous recessive parent and get that recessive trait. So no, there's no possibility for their child to have blue eyes. Now let's look at a different example. Let's say in this example, instead, mom still has brown eyes, but she is heterozygous. Still has brown eyes. Dad is going to still be homozygous recessive. He's got blue eyes. So, could they have a blue-eyed baby? Let's find out. So we draw our Punnett square. We'll do the same thing we did last time. We'll put mom's alleles across the top. She has capital B and lowercase b this time. Dad's alleles down the side. He has lowercase b, lowercase b. Now we're going to fill in our Punnett square. So here we have this baby. This randomly chosen baby could have one capital B and a lowercase b. So same as our baby before, heterozygous. Here, we're going to have potentially, we have a baby that could have two lowercase b's. We'll have capital B, lowercase b, and lowercase b, lowercase b. Aha! So notice that now our potential baby, we don't know which of these babies they'll have, but this tells us possibilities. And is there a possibility of having a baby with blue eyes? Yes. These two babies would have blue eyes because they have two copies of the recessive trait. They don't have that dominant trait to overpower it. And then these two babies here would have, these two babies could have brown eyes. So this is how a brown-eyed parent could have a blue-eyed child. And this is basically what Mendel figured out with his peas. We are going to look a whole bunch more at this over the course of the next couple of weeks, and we are going to practice Punnett squares. For this week, you do not need to know about how to do these Punnett squares. I just wanted you to see them and understand them. For this week's main task, you are going to be working on learning this vocab. These terms in red, think of this as our word wall. Alleles, dominant, recessive, homozygous, and heterozygous. And genotype and phenotype. You're going to practice those terms so that we're ready to talk about Punnett squares next week, and we'll start doing predictions about what traits a baby would have. Now, if this was confusing, or if you have any questions for me, if this wasn't enough for you, I will be available live today. I'm going to teach this lesson live at 11 p.m. Sorry, not 11 p.m., 11 a.m. And there's a link to that in the document with your notes. But your next step should be to rewatch this, or you might have been taking notes while you were watching this, but you should go through and do the Tuesday practice, filling in the notes using all of these terms. So you want to come back to this, you want to pause the video periodically and use this to fill in the notes. Email me if you have any questions. I am available online, and I look forward to hearing from some of you. I will also be doing live sessions for some of the other activities. You can also find the links for those. We'll do live science on Wednesday and Thursday for the basic practice and the reading practice. I will go through those live at noon on Wednesday and Thursday. So you're welcome to stop in. You're welcome to come ask a simple question, or you can come and we will do the whole worksheet together. I want to support you in whatever way that I can. So, thanks for sticking with me. This was a little bit longer of a video, but I was introducing a whole bunch of concepts. So, email me if you have any questions, and let's get to practicing this. Take care.